As a UC Santa Cruz Alumni Council member, I'd like to welcome you to our monthly speaker series, Slugs and Steins, Lectures from UC Santa Cruz. My name is John Madrid, and I am the Executive Vice President of the UCSC Alumni Association. For those who are new, our Slugs and Steins series engages a UC Santa Cruz faculty member in discussion with you, the local community of Silicon Valley, and our extended community online, with the goal of making us all Renaissance people. We wanted to feel just like you're at Santa Cruz, sitting in class, but with drinks and without tests. David is with his grandkids in Switzerland, so I'm filling in for him this evening, and I'm thrilled to be here. Mike will be helping me with the Q&A, and you'll hear more from him at the end. Before we get started, we'd like to take a poll to get to know our audience and where you are tuning in from. Excuse me. New this month, we would also like to get your views on whether the time has come to consider going back to in-person events. Some of you may remember that until the pandemic hit, we used to meet at a restaurant in San Jose. Thanks to Zoom, we have been able to reach a much larger audience outside of the Silicon Valley, but we do miss seeing your faces. If you can meet in person, would you want to? Please take a moment to answer a few quick questions that will pop up on your screen. We'll share the results after we've given everyone a moment to respond. Now you should be able to see the results of our poll and who's in the virtual room with you. Today we raise a virtual Stein with UCSC Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics, Mark Amingwall, Director of UCSC's Bilingualism Research Laboratory. Mark's research focuses on experimental phonetics, bilingualism, and psycholinguistics. His work has been published in international venues such as Journal of Phonetics, the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, Phonetica, Bilingualism, Language and Cognition, International Journal of Bilingualism, Linguistic Approaches to Bilingualism, and Applied Psycholinguistics. He is also the editor of the forthcoming Cambridge Handbook of Bilingual Phonetics and Phonology. He earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Balearic Islands, his master's from Penn State, and his doctorate from the University of Texas in Austin. If you have questions for our professor, please type them in Zoom's Q&A box. You don't need to wait until the last minute. Type them in at any time. If you see someone else's question that you like, you can upvote it and we'll ask it sooner. This talk is being recorded. In a few days, you'll be able to find it on the UC Santa Cruz Arts and Lectures YouTube channel. We'll post the link in our social media channels and follow-up emails. Okay, does everyone have their Stein? Great, I've got your slug, Professor Amingwall.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me at this event. And in today's talk, I want to talk about something that's very personal for a lot of us, and that is language. We are immersed in language during almost every moment of our lives. We use language to communicate our feelings, thoughts, and ideas, to connect with family and friends, to identify with our culture, and to understand the world around us. For many people in the world, this rich linguistic environment involves not just one language, but two or more. Multilingualism is extremely personal to me. I was born in Scotland and grew up in a bilingual region of Spain, speaking Catalan and Spanish. So as an English heritage speaker, I grew up speaking English at home with my mom, and I was simultaneously exposed to three languages: English with my mom, Catalan, that was a language spoken in Mallorca, where I grew up, and Spanish, that was also the language of the community and the language of the country. So I function in a multilingual and multi-dialectal world, and I really feel that I've been enriched by this opportunity. So I want to start with a quote from a Center of Applied Linguistics, and it's the following. So in today's global society, the ability to speak more than one language is a valuable asset. Americans fluent in languages other than English enhance our economic competitiveness abroad, improve global communication, help to maintain our political and security interests, and promote tolerance and intercultural awareness. So I'm going to start just talking about bilingualism in the world. And we know that there are many more languages. The Ethnologue has the number right now at 7,117 languages. Then there are countries. According to certain estimates, we have between 195 to 197 countries in the world. So it is inevitable that an enormous amount of language contact takes place in the world today. More than half of the world's population is estimated to use 2 or more languages in everyday life. And bilingualism is present on all continents, in all classes of society, and in all language groups. So for instance, in Asia and Africa, many people are bi or multilingual, although precise figures are often lacking. In Europe, it is estimated that a bit more than half of the population is at least bilingual. Smaller countries such as Luxembourg, Switzerland, and the Netherlands have many bilinguals, whereas largest countries such as Great Britain or France have fewer of them. And what about the US? There is the estimation that approximately 23% of the US is bilingual. That amounts to around 70 million inhabitants. And bilingualism in the US is very diverse, displaying a variety of language pairs: English with Native American languages, older colonial languages, and recent immigration languages as well. And Grosjean and other colleagues as the US has probably been the home of more bilingual speakers than any other country in the world. Now, this bilingualism is often short-lived and transitional. We find that bilingualism typically covers a brief period, spanning 2 or 3 generations, between monolingualism in a minority language and monolingualism in English. And unfortunately, that's the pattern that we've been finding with many minority languages in this country, with the loss of the minority heritage language in up to 3 generations. So I would encourage everyone, learn another language. And you might be wondering why. Well, first of all, research has shown that there is evidence of cognitive and neurological advantages, also social benefits. And for that, I mean having the ability to explore a culture through its native tongue, or talking to someone with whom you might otherwise never be able to communicate with. But research has also shown advantages in the form of social flexibility. And social flexibility refers here to 2 aspects of this type of social benefit. One is the ability to switch with ease and adapt between different social environments. And 2, to accurately read social cues in the environment. And then finally, there are some economic benefits. Being bilingual brings substantial economic benefit. Employers prefer to employ bilingual employees, and these bilingual employees tend to earn more. So for the rest of this talk this evening, I'm going to follow the following outline. I'm going to start with just some basic terminology. I'm going to introduce some key terms just that are necessary for our conversation tonight. I will then delve into misconceptions, facts, myths about bilingualism. I will briefly have a quick stop at the area of cognitive benefits of bilingualism. And finally, we'll conclude with some examples from my own research in the lab here at UCSC and in collaboration with colleagues in other universities in other countries. We'll be focusing on several examples on bilingual and multilingual speech to gather more information on the flexibility of bilinguals and multilinguals to overcome cross-language influence in their speech. All right, so if we start with some key terms, one that should be very, very obvious here would be second language acquisition. Second language would be L2. And here, what you will be able to see is second language acquisition is the process of learning a second language once the native language is established. Second language acquisition can occur at any point in life. When we talk about monolingual, bilingual, or trilingual, we're referring to a person who speaks 1, 2, or 3 languages, right? Polyglot is another term that we would use for someone that speaks multiple languages. The difference between sequential bilingual and a simultaneous bilingual is an important one as well. So for someone that's a sequential bilingual, we're referring to a person who learns a second language after the first language has been established. And the second language is typically introduced after the age of 3. So we can have a sequential bilingual that could be an early bilingual. That is someone that's exposed and learns one language since birth, and another one that occurs at a different sequence in life. I would say for it to be early bilingual, it would actually have to occur before the age of 13. It's kind of a good cutoff area. As for a late bilingual, would be someone that acquires their second language or successive languages after that period, after the age of 13, more or less. Simultaneous bilingual, on the other hand, would be a person who learns 2 languages at the same time. And both languages are introduced early in life, since birth. Then code switching here refers to instances when bilingual speakers switch from one language to another within sentences or discourse. And for the situation that we find in California, often between switching between languages and another, typically we've been seeing that in between Spanish and English, and people will use the term Spanglish to refer to that. But code switching would be the linguistic term that we would be using in this context. And finally, language transfer, here also known as language interference or cross-linguistic influence. Here we're referring to the influence that knowledge of one language has on an individual's learning or use of another language. The thing here is that typically there's been the assumption that the first language will affect how we learn the second language, but there's plenty of evidence and consensus in the field that now we know that the second language also affects the structure of the first language in many other contexts as well. So once we've gotten to this point, I have to say that first and foremost, that a positive appraisal of bilingualism is a fairly recent phenomenon. For much of the 20th century, bilingualism was thought to result in cognitive disadvantages, as some of the quotes that I'm going to be showing you here. In this quote, we see children's ability to learn language is challenged by the acquisition of 2 languages at the same time. Bilingualism strains the child's language capacity, leading to impaired forms of language development. Bilingual education puts children at risk for academic failure and delay. or the use of a foreign language in the home is one of the chief factors in producing mental retardation as measured by intelligence tests. So at this point, we know that, and research has shown consistently that there are many benefits of being bilingual. Despite the overwhelming research that provides otherwise, however, we still have many misconceptions about learning two languages. And many of these myths have had a long life. You probably heard many of the statements I'm going to show you now, but I would like to know, what are your thoughts on the following statements? Do you think they're true or false? Please take a minute to answer these questions. All right, so having a look at the results, we can see that these six statements are, the majority of answers indicate that they are false, and that is correct. All of these statements here are false. Some of these myths have more of an effect and stay in the general knowledge of most people, but the truth is that all of these are false. And we're going to go step by step to discuss them. So the first one, bilinguals have equal and perfect knowledge of their languages. So we know at this point that this is false. Bilinguals know their languages to the level that they need to know them. Some bilinguals are dominant in one language. Others do not know how to read and write one of their languages. Others have only passive knowledge of a language. So what is important to keep in mind is that bilinguals are very diverse, such as monolinguals are as well. For the second one, bilinguals acquire their two or more languages in childhood. That is also false. So one can become bilingual in childhood, but also in adolescence and in adulthood. You're never too late to be able to learn another language. Many adults become bilingual because they move from one country or one region to another and have to acquire a second language. And in general, people become bilingual because life requires the use of two or more languages. And this can be due to immigration, education, intermarriage, contact with other linguistic groups within a country, and many other cases and scenarios. For the third statement, bilinguals have no accent in their different languages. This is also false, and I will get back to this later in this talk. We all have an accent. If we are referring to a foreign accent, having an accent or not in a language does not make you more or less bilingual. It depends on when you acquired your languages most of the time, among other factors. And some extremely fluent and balanced bilinguals have an accent in one or the other language. We're going to the fourth here. Mixing languages is a sign of laziness in bilinguals. Also false. Mixing languages such as code switching, as we've just discussed, and borrowing is a very common behavior in bilinguals speaking to other bilinguals. The two language repertoires are available in bilingual situations and can be used at will. Many expressions and words are better said in one or the other language. Mixing permits to use the right one without having to translate, which simply may not do justice to what one wants to express. Children who mix languages will continue to do so as they age. This statement is also false. Children will stop mixing both languages as they increase their vocabulary and are able to express themselves fully in one. Mixing of languages is actually a way of getting their meaning across by using both languages. And children who speak only one language do not have this advantage and will often use gestures to fill in for the words they do not know. So we're going to move to the very last statement, which is the bilingualism causes children to be confused and will delay language acquisition. Unfortunately, this belief here, this statement here has done a lot of damage in the intergenerational transmission of especially minority languages in this country. And this is one of the main causes that can explain the loss of the minority language in 3 generations. It is also false. So we know that bilingual children are not delayed in their language acquisition. Bilingual children reach their developmental milestones at the same time, at a similar time at least, as monolingual children. And if a child has a speech or language delay, it will be present in both languages, but it is not caused by learning 2 languages. And mixing 2 languages does not imply that a child is confused. Great, so when we're talking about a bilingual individual that has 2 linguistic systems, we know that we're going to be activating one language or another, depending on the needs that we have in the specific communicative context. So when a bilingual individual uses one language, the other is active at the same time to a certain extent. Bilinguals display an incredible capacity to switch between languages depending on the communicative purpose and the linguistic context. And this is something that a bilingual individual has to do on a daily basis to understand which language this person has to use. And their sensitivity to specific cues in the speech is going to be used very broadly to be able to keep languages apart as much as possible. So what I want to be clear here is that we cannot think about a bilingual as someone who can switch one language on and one language off. But it would probably be a lot clearer to think about the language selection or activation of a bilingual individual if we think of a dimmer. So we can see there's going to be gradual activation to different degrees between one language and the other. So I'm going to dive into the third part, which is the cognitive consequences of bilingualism. This research, the really exploded, and 10 years ago, more or less, got a lot of attention in the media, where we know that to maintain the relative balance between 2 languages, the bilingual brain relies on executive functions. And executive functions are a regulatory system of general cognitive abilities that include processes such as attention and inhibition. Because of both of a bilingual individual's language systems are always active and competing, that person uses these control mechanisms every time he or he speaks or listens in one language, in one of their languages. So this constant practice strengthens the control mechanisms and changes the associated brain regions. There's research that has shown this type of exercise that a bilingual has to do has consequences that can be found in the brain. And research has also shown that bilingual adults are able to learn a third language better than monolingual adults can learn a second language. We also need to mention that the ability to ignore competing perceptual information and focus on the relevant aspects of the input is called inhibitory control. And bilingual children and adults often perform better than monolinguals at switching between two tasks. So for instance, when bilinguals have to switch from categorizing objects by color, for instance, red or green, to categorizing them by shape, maybe a circle or a triangle, they do so more rapidly than monolingual people, reflecting better cognitive control when changing strategies on the fly. These benefits seem to start quite early. So there have been researchers that have shown bilingualism to positively influence attention and conflict management in infants as young as 7 months old. The cognitive and neurological benefits of bilingualism also seem to extend into older adulthood. So here there's plenty of research in these past years that have shown that bilingualism appears to provide a means of fending off a natural decline of cognitive function and maintaining what is called cognitive reserve. And cognitive reserve refers to the efficient utilization of brain networks to enhance brain function during aging. So older bilinguals enjoy improved memory and executive control relative to older monolingual people, which can lead to real-world health benefits. And bilingualism can also protect against illnesses that come with aging, like Alzheimer's disease. So Craig, in a study with colleagues in 2010, found that the bilingual patients had been diagnosed 4.3 years later and had reported the onset of symptoms 5.1 years later than the monolingual patients. The groups were equivalent on measures of cognitive and occupational level. There was no apparent effect of immigration status, and the monolingual patients had received more formal education. There were also no gender effects. So the good news is that these attention and aging benefits do not seem to be exclusive to individuals who are raised bilingual. They are also seen in individuals who learn a second language later in life. So this brings me to the questions that have really been shaping my research agenda. How are bilingual and multilingual speakers able to keep the sound systems of their languages separate? So as I was saying, there is a certain type of exercise that multilingual speakers must master in order to speak different languages, depending on the communicative intent and the linguistic context. So in that case, in which ways are the sound systems prone to cross-linguistic influence in bilingual speech, production and perception and processing of sounds in both of their languages? In other words, how flexible are the sound systems of multilingual speakers? So we know that learning a language is a variable process, and speakers often differ in their acquisition of each component of the linguistic system, such as vocabulary and grammar, right? So we see this in our language classrooms and in ourselves. You know, those of you who have been learning a second language or a third language or a fourth language, this will hit close to home, right? Learning to accurately pronounce sounds in another language is an especially challenging task. First, because we need to develop a new sound system that may or may not be similar or dissimilar from our other language or languages that we speak. So we need to have the ability to produce and perceive sounds that may not be found in the speaker's native language. Foreign or L1 influenced accent is typical, despite many years of experience. And in addition to speaking with an accent, language users also hear with an accent. And hearing and speaking with an accent is minimized the earlier the language is acquired. So the idea that if you learn a language earlier, it's going to be better, that very much applies to pronunciation, to second language pronunciation, right? To phonetics and phonology. However, age of acquisition alone does not necessarily guarantee native-like proficiency. So in order to better understand the phonological phonetic systems of bilingual speakers, we necessarily have to consider many variables. We need to consider variables such as language proficiency, language dominance, language use, age of exposure, literacy in a language, and other biographical non-linguistic variables that are particular to the experiences of our bilingual participants. So in my research, the main goal that I have is to comprehend the effects of language use on the mental representations of sound categories and the structure of the sound systems of bilingual speakers. I use an interdisciplinary and experimental approach to investigate bilingual and multilingual speech production, perception, and processing of sounds in each of their languages. I study a diversity of bilingual individuals, such as early bilinguals, late bilinguals, simultaneous and sequential bilinguals, heritage speakers, second language and third language learners, and also a diversity of bilingual and multilingual communities. The language pairs that I've been including in my research in the past 10 years include Spanish Catalan bilinguals, Spanish Galician bilinguals. Those are bilingual communities in Spain, as well as Spanish Portuguese bilinguals, Spanish English bilinguals in the US and abroad in Spain as well, Spanish English and Japanese trilinguals, and then Spanish Ñañú bilinguals. Ñañú is an endangered language in central Mexico. For my research, I depend on different methodologies that are needed to collect data in the lab and in the field. A lot of acoustic data has been collected in our UCSC bilingualism research lab in the past 8 years, and also in the past 5 years in collaboration with colleagues at the Laboratorio de Estudios Lingüísticos at the Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro in Mexico. We have also been collecting acoustic, perceptual, and electrophysiological data. So the data, the linguistic data, as I said, are going to be needed to describe speech production, speech perception. We're going to depend on acoustic, behavioral, and electrophysiological data. So I want to take a moment with the time that we have left for today's talk to introduce some examples of some research studies that we've been conducting, that I've been conducting collaboratively these past years. The very first experiment that I'm going to describe refers to that of Latinx Spanish-English bilinguals, Spanish heritage speakers, here students at UCSC, that are early bilinguals. And I'm going to be focusing on the effects of early exposure to the language and how that can have consequences during adulthood. The second experiment will focus on a second language learner group, that's an English monolingual group learning Japanese, compared to a Spanish English bilingual group learning Japanese as a third language. So we're comparing second language and third language acquisition. And then finally, in the third experiment, I will present some results of Ñañú Spanish bilinguals' perception of the sounds of their native language. And I'm going to be presenting some behavioral and electrophysiological data. Perfect. So for the very first experiment here, the main goal was to focus on describing the differences between three groups of Spanish English bilinguals. One group was a group of second language Spanish learners that were Spanish studies majors at UCSC, had grown up speaking English at home, but were majoring in Spanish on campus, and they were compared to their classmates that were English dominant heritage speakers of Spanish. And here the important part is that the heritage speaker group was composed of two different bilingual groups, as we've described in the key terms. A group of bilinguals that grew up speaking both languages since birth, those are simultaneous bilinguals, and also those that were brought up in a monolingual setting, monolingual Spanish setting, and became bilingual after starting school in the US, English, at around 5 or 6. Those are early sequential bilinguals. And specifically, I was focusing on the sounds ba, da, and ga in Spanish, which there's interestingly a different pronunciation for those sounds, depending if they're at the beginning of a word, for instance, or if they occur in a different context in the word. Maybe I'm going to be comparing here word initial and word internal intervocalically. So here you have an example of the word bono, bond, and abono, fertilizer. And for those of you that speak Spanish, you will agree that the word ba, the sound ba in these two words is different. So bono, there's a complete closure, and abono, there's a smoother, softer, more lenited pronunciation of this sound. Now that's something that's very subtle. That's something that a native speaker does without really giving it much thought. But for a second language learner of Spanish, that is one of the key differences in sounding native-like or not. So as I said, I'm comparing late bilinguals with early bilinguals, which are this group of heritage speakers. So the question here is if the type of early acquisition, so remember, simultaneous bilingualism or sequential bilingualism, if that will have an effect on the pronunciation of language-specific sounds in the heritage language in adulthood. So the participants consisted of 30 female undergraduate students at UCSC. And in this box, in this figure here, you can see the three groups. The very first group is the simultaneous bilingual heritage speaker group. The second group is the sequential bilingual heritage speaker group. And the third group that where you see marked as L2, that's the second language Spanish learner group. And from what you can see here on the BLP dominant score scale is the larger the number, they're more English dominant, and the closer to 0, that's to the left, they'll be more balanced bilingual. So what is important here is that the simultaneous and sequential bilingual group have a similar self-rating in their language dominance. The simultaneous bilinguals grew up with one parent, one language. So one parent spoke Spanish, the other parent spoke English. The sequential bilingual group had both Spanish-speaking parents, and the L2 Spanish learner group had both English-speaking parents. So the acoustic analysis consisted in measuring the recordings of their pronunciation of these types of words that had the sounds ba, da, and ga embedded in different phonological contexts that would elicit different types of sounds. So here we have the word Here I'm showing you the waveform and the spectrogram of the utterance Habon. Habon means soap in Spanish. And you can see here two arrows. The first arrow on the B shows the intensity drop of the B. That's signaling a full closure of the articulators. So there's acoustic silence, and then the opening of the following vowel. So if we see the difference, the distance, right, between the lower point in the intensity curve of that B and the highest point of the following vowel, we show that this is a very stop-like, very B, Habon, right? That's very non-native like pronunciation of this B in this specific context. Now, if we compare this pronunciation of the word Habon with this other pronunciation of the word Habon, you can see that the B, the intensity of the B and the intensity of the following vowel is much closer. The distance is reduced. So that makes it a more lenited pronunciation, and that would be what we expect native speakers to do. So here you have an example of the Habon, here we have the Habon. So this was measured for over 3,000 items of each of these participants. And we found that there was an effect of the type of early bilingualism on bilingual speech production. So sequential bilinguals, remember, sequential bilinguals were those who grew up the first 5 years of their life hearing Spanish at home from both parents. And they are performing differently than simultaneous bilinguals who grew up in a household where both languages were already being used and were exposed to both Spanish and English. And we're seeing a difference in how sequential bilinguals are performing in comparison to simultaneous bilinguals with respect to the degree of spermatization of these B, D, and G sounds in intervocalic position. And the results suggest here that the quantity of input, the quantity of exposure to the language that's received early in life can have a lasting effect on the acoustic realization of allophonic variants in the non-dominant language. But bilingualism, so especially like these bilinguals, use one of their languages while they're suppressing the influence of the other. So can we experimentally induce different degrees of activation of the languages of a bilingual individual? And if this is the case, and it affects bilinguals with their two languages, what will occur if we do that same type of activation with 3 languages for a trilingual speaker? And that takes us to the second experiment that was also carried out on campus with students that were taking Japanese language classes. And here specifically, I'm investigating the pronunciation of Spanish, English, and Japanese K. So K is a very specific sound that's different in each of these 3 languages. And here I'm comparing second language learners of Japanese with third language learners of Japanese. What the experiment assumes here is that bilingual and trilingual activation can be induced experimentally if the stimuli in the experiment come from each language and the task that's asked of the participants requires processing of multiple languages. And the phonetic variable that I'm going to describe here that was measured was voice onset time. And voice onset time refers to the timing of the release of the air for a stop consonant, like a P, a T, or a K, and the onset of voicing, that's the vocal fold vibration that occurs during the following vowel. So for instance, Spanish and English are a really great example because they're pretty distinct VOT patterns. VOT will be the equivalent of aspiration. So we have more air that comes out with these consonants when they're pronounced. Spanish and English really have a very different pattern of aspiration with these sounds. So you can really tell if someone has Spanish influence in their English or English accent in their Spanish based on only these sounds. So English, Japanese, and Spanish are a great combination to investigate this phonetic variable because we can see that there's different voicing timing patterns. So as I was describing, we're talking about time, we're talking about duration, we're talking specifically about milliseconds. So for a word like calendar in English, we could expect this delay in the beginning after the pronunciation of the ka and the beginning of the voicing of the following vowel to be somewhere between 80 and 120 milliseconds. For Spanish, the word calendario, we would expect it to be around 20 to 30 milliseconds. And Japanese, we would expect it to be somewhere in the middle based on previous research. So we might expect VOT of between 40 to 70 milliseconds. So we have a very distinct pattern. If you want to sound native-like in English, in Spanish, or in Japanese, you need to have the ability to lengthen or shorten your VOT patterns when you're pronouncing these sounds in order to be in the native-like range. So for this study, we had 15 undergraduate students at UCSC. We had 5 in each of the 3 groups. We had an L1 English, L2 Japanese bilingual group, an L1 Spanish, L2 English, L3 Japanese trilingual group, and a control group of Japanese native speakers. So the ages of all these participants range between 19 and 22 years old. At the time of testing, the Japanese learners were enrolled in Japanese 4 at UC Santa Cruz. That would be considered a novice high sublevel of Japanese language study, according to the ACFO guidelines. And the Japanese native speakers were intermediate advanced English speakers that had a mean score of 105 in the TOEFL test. The key part of this study is that they participated in a multiple experimental sessions. So they came to the lab in different sessions to pronounce specific target items in a soundproof booth in our lab in a monolingual session, in bilingual sessions, and for the trilingual speakers, they also participated in a trilingual session, right? So they were reading words that came up in the computer screen. Maybe they only read words in English in the monolingual session. When they came back and they only did it in Japanese, that was the Japanese monolingual session. There was also the English-Japanese bilingual session, right? And for the trilingual session, they would have English, Japanese, Spanish, and they would be mixed. They would be color-coded, but this would be keeping the participants on edge because they had to switch. They had to keep all languages activated, right? So I'm going to show you the results of this test. I'm going to show you some of the results at least. First of all, I'm going to show you a difference in language. And what you can see here are the 3 groups that have their distributions of VOTs. Those are the measurements of those consonants, K consonants. And what you can see is that the white boxes here represent their English pronunciation. The light gray would be the Japanese pronunciation, and the Spanish would be the darker gray would be the Spanish pronunciation. So you can see that there's a distinct different distribution. So looking at this graph on the VOT on the X bar, we can see that the farther to the right would be a larger VOT, a more English-like pronunciation, and the more to the left would be a more Spanish-like pronunciation. And somewhere in the middle, you would expect Japanese. So what's really interesting and cool is that these Japanese 4 students are maintaining distinct K consonants in each of their languages. And we see that for the bilingual groups, but we also see it for the trilingual group that, as you can see at the very top, is maintaining separate distributions for their K in each of their sounds, right? And we can see that the English and Japanese, there's some overlap, but they're maintaining different sounds. And the same occurs with the Japanese L1 and English L2. Just to show you the wackiness of this experiment, in this graph, you can see each of the sessions of the trilingual speakers. So again, white would represent English, light gray would represent Japanese, and the dark gray here would represent Spanish. And what I want to show you here is that for the trilingual speakers that are juggling the sound systems of their three languages, you can see that depending on the session that they're participating in, depending on the degree of activation of each of their languages, we can find some shifts between one of their categories, right? So we can focus on their most vulnerable language, which is their least dominant language, their Japanese. We see drastic differences in their pronunciation of these sounds, depending on the session that they're participating in. However, and I want to stress this, is that they are very flexible in maintaining them distinct, right? So they are able to shift in tandem to keep those categories separate. So these bilingual and trilingual speakers maintain language-specific phonological categories in their L1, in their L2, and in their L3, overcoming long-term traces of one language influencing the other, despite dynamic interlingual interference, despite this activation tweaking that we are causing experimentally. And this demonstrates the resourcefulness of bilingual and multilingual speakers to maintain distinct sound categories in each of their languages. And for the final experiment that I'm going to be showing you today, I'm going to show you some behavioral and electrophysiological data that were used to investigate if Spanish Otomí or Ñañú bilinguals can maintain phonemic contrast in their native language. This is work that's been a collaboration with colleagues, Dr. Stanislav Mulik, Dr. Aide Carrasco-Ortiz, and Dr. Gloria Abecilla Ramirez at the Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro. And Ñaño is a variety of Otomí, an endangered indigenous language that's spoken in central Mexico. And we're focusing here on a variety of Otomí that's spoken in the state of Querétaro in Mexico. And specifically, the vowel system gives us the opportunity to investigate some pretty interesting data. So the variety of Otomí spoken in Santiago Mezquititlan, that's also known as Ñaño, presents a vowel system of 9 vowels and 1 nasal vowel. Spanish, on the other hand here, has a symmetrical 5 vowel system. In a situation of extensive language contact, where there's a minoritized language, endangered language, such as Ñaño, that has a larger vowel system, we're going to see that the Ñaño vowels are vulnerable to contact-induced language change, especially when they're in contact with a majority language such as Spanish in Mexico. So in this case, we could predict that the larger Ñaño vowel system would be likely to be simplified and look more like the Spanish one in this situation of language contact. As you can see here, there's the E vowel and the O vowel in Spanish, when there's an extra bin vowel contrast, E, and O, with this language, with Ñaño. So if we're losing proficiency in Ñaño, there's a loss of intergenerational transmission. Those vowels are the first to go. So for this study, we relied on acoustic, behavioral, and electrophysiological data to answer our research questions. So in comparison to the acoustic data that I've shown you in the 2 previous experiments, event-related brain potentials, ERPs, provide high-resolution measures of the time course of neuronal activity patterns associated with perceptual and cognitive processes. Previous studies have observed 2 auditory event-related responses known as the N200 and P300, which have been associated to the processing of phoneme discrimination and active auditory perception. The N200, as you can see here, is a negative going amplitude shift peaking around 200 milliseconds after stimulus onset, and it indexes acoustic discrimination from a purely physical standpoint. While the P300, that's a positive going ERP component that peaks at around 300 milliseconds after stimulus onset, reflects a conscious classification of a change in a phonemic category. So both the N200 and the P300 out of great interest to our study because these components can be sensitive to the boundaries between two phonemes, two sound categories in the Ñañú sound system. So what we found is that when these bilingual and monolingual participants in lab had to identify vowel contrasts such as do and da that are contrast and phonemic in the Ñañú, but not in Spanish, we find that they convey different meanings in the Ñañú sound system. And Ñañú heritage speakers showed an electrophysiological response to sounds of their native language with higher amplitude in the 100 to 200 millisecond temporal window in comparison to Spanish monolinguals. So surprisingly, even though the perceptual results of the behavioral studies showed that both groups, the Ñañú Spanish bilinguals and the Spanish monolinguals, demonstrated high accuracy in perceiving vowels that exist in Ñañú but not in Spanish, the results of the ERP suggest that there is a trace of the native language in the brain of the heritage speakers and not in those Spanish monolinguals. So even in a case like this, with limited use of Ñañú in their everyday life, these speakers were found to maintain sensitivity to the sounds of their native language. And these findings have also mirrored other results that have been found with the phonetic abilities, perceptual abilities of international adoptees, and also of overhearers of minority languages in the US. So I have a few final words to conclude today's talk on monolingualism, bilingualism, multilingualism, and that is that immigration patterns in the US have made accented speech and bilingualism a political issue in many parts of the country. Do you all remember the Arizona law in 2010 that sought to limit children's exposure to foreign accented teachers? I remember that came up when I was finishing my master, when I was starting my PhD, and I was shocked that these type of policies were still happening. And that stigma and bias towards accented speech for bilingual speakers was very much present. So it becomes increasingly important for educators, for public policy professionals, and psychologists to better understand how accented speech is processed, both linguistically and socially, and how listeners use this information to make judgments about bilingual speakers in the US and abroad. For non-native English speakers being educated in the United States, research shows that the variable production of bilinguals is not necessarily indicative of a lack of proficiency. Accentedness in one or both languages of an adult bilingual may be a necessary consequence of bilingualism, and the stigma and discrimination that's associated with a perceivable accent is linguistically indefensible. A non-native accent may be present to some degree, even the most balanced bilinguals who have grown up with continuous, uninterrupted exposure to both languages. So to conclude this presentation, just remember, it's never late, it's never too late. Monolingualism can be cured. And there are a few options to support more research on bilingualism, supporting our Department of Languages and Applied Linguistics, but also to support bilingual communities in the Central Valley in California with Latino Community Foundation as well. And before I conclude and wrap up, I have to thank and need to thank my collaborators and research assistants in the UCSC Bilingualism Research Lab and my colleagues at the Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro in Mexico that enable type place. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mark. This is Mike. We have a lot of good questions already in the Q&A box. We've got about 12 questions. Just a reminder, keep your questions coming. If you have anything you'd like to ask Mark, type them in the Q&A box, and go ahead and scan through the other questions and see if there's anything you want to upvote. So let me start with the question from Mary. She asks, how difficult is it to learn a second or third language later in life, i.e. after 50 or 60 years old?
Great, that's a great question, Mary, and it's going to depend on a lot of factors. Learning to ride a bike later in life is harder than learning earlier in life. We have a general effect of aging that occurs not just with language acquisition, but with every other aspect of cognitive and also physical aspect of anything else we will want to start learning right at a certain age. But that being said, it's going to depend from individual to individual. And I would add here that research is showing that cognitive reserve that occurs from using two languages on a daily basis provides us some layers of protection to also be able to stay cognitively agile, if that makes sense.
Great. And the next question is, does learning a signed language, for example, ASL, have similar neurological effects as learning two spoken languages?
Yes, there is research showing that in this case, for someone that's learning a sign language, they are known as bimodal bilinguals. So we're talking about different modalities. So the advantages that are found for bilingual speakers are applicable to bimodal bilinguals in the same way. It doesn't have to be a spoken language that gives you those advantages of bilingualism. We're seeing those same advantages across modalities as well.
We have a question from Tob. You mentioned that bilinguals, quote, hear with an accent, not just speak with an accent. Please elaborate.
Yes, so there's a long-going debate on the field about if perception and production, so listening, comprehending specific sounds and producing them, if they're two sides of the same coin, or what comes first? Do we have to hear and listen to specific differences between sounds to be able to accurately pronounce them? And there are mixed results. So there are studies to show that you can perceive sounds accurately, but have problems producing them, and others showing the opposite, that we are able to produce sounds without accurately perceiving them, right? So for instance, an idea that comes to mind is there are certain contrasts in languages that we don't have in English. Or for instance, if you're a native Japanese learner, you might have you're gonna have some difficulties distinguishing between R's and L's. That for a native English speaker, it's just something that we do on a regular basis. There's minimal pairs and we can contrast them. So it really depends on the sound inventory of our native language. And that's going to determine the degree of accuracy or the degree of easiness to learn another sound or difficulty.
And next we have a question from Louise. Do short dreams in second and third language indicate any level of proficiency in those languages?
Short dreams, that's very interesting. That means that if you're, say you're taking French lessons and you're starting to dream in French, I would say that's an indicator that you're doing your homework and you're improving your proficiency, right? When you start to think or to dream in that language. There are certain milestones that we would expect in the acquisition of sound. So when we're exposed to that language, it's going to percolate into many other aspects of our life, including when we're dreaming.
And we have a question from Matt. Did you have trouble with Romaji versus hiragana influencing Japanese pronunciation? My Japanese classes tried to get to hiragana quickly to get us pronouncing words more accurately.
That's very interesting because you're right. That is something to take into account. For the trilingual study that I was describing, it's not just a difference in sounds, it's a difference in scripts, right? What I did not explain is that we had a combination of hiragana and katakana as well, because there are certain words that are of a Sino-Tibetan origin and others that are loan words from other languages. So like calendar, calendario, calendar, those are three-way cognates. And there's a different type of script that we would have there compared to other non-cognates. So original words used in Japanese that were not borrowed from another language. So it's interesting to consider if one script would have processing facilitation effects or not. And there's some interesting work that's been focusing lately on orthographic effects on second language pronunciation and perception. And I think that's the next area of research that's going to be clearing up a lot of these questions.
Next, we have a question from Kevin. I have attempted to learn 4 languages in my life, but have only managed to retain the first 2. Is the rapid loss of language, let's say less than a decade, common?
Yes, very much so, because how much we're going to maintain our language or how much we're going to lose our language, also known as attrition, is going to depend on how much we use it or how much we need it. So we find attrition in a second, third, fourth language to occur quite rapidly in cases where we stop using that language. So there are examples of people that maybe move to Germany because they're working there for 3 or 4 years, and then move back and stop using German altogether, and they start to realize that they're having difficulty to find those words that they used to have. They're less fluent. They're having more of an interference of their other languages. That's very common. It's going to depend on how much we use the language, and we're seeing that also for people's first language. Right, so there are many examples in this country of immigrants that arrive to the US, will have another language, could be Spanish, could be Mandarin, could be Tagalog, could be Korean, and then are immersed in a mostly monolingual English environment. And they're going to start losing different aspects of their first language because of this long-term attrition of their what once was their dominant language. So what I want to really clarify here is that the nature of bilingualism, the nature of the relationship between the languages, is one that's clearly dynamic, never static. It's going to be changing throughout our lifetime.
Okay, we have a scenario from Delia. Let's see if this counts as a bilingual. Growing up in a rural area, speaking local dialect while going to school using the national standardized language. And she says they share the same written form.
Mm-hmm. What I'm going to say there is that dialect, the term dialect and the term language is used very differently in different parts of the world. Dialects can be mutually intelligible in some contexts. In other contexts, in other countries, dialect can be completely different languages in the sense that people cannot communicate with each other. There's different degrees of closeness or separation between languages, but there's also interesting work on not just bilingualism, but bidialectalism. And we're finding similar cognitive processing scenarios that occur similarly when we're listening to different dialects of the same language than when we're speaking and listening to different languages.
Next, we have a question from Nancy. How do Creole languages fit into this?
Well, Creole languages fit in exactly the same way for the individual bilingual speaker, the same way that any other language. A Creole language has a system, has different ways of creating words, of creating sentences, creating sounds, producing words, producing sounds, producing meaning. So we're going to be finding the same type of effects of bilingualism in a Creole language than we find in any other language.
So a question from Kenneth. What are the most efficient ways to learn a second language later in life?
Ooh, that's a big a big question. There are a lot of methodologies they're used to learn new languages at different stages in life, later in life. I would say that one that is a common denominator in different methodologies is to have to be exposed to enough input, to hear the language, to use the language, to express a communicative purpose. So you need to be able to ask, you need to be able to learn, you need to be able to interact. You don't need to just repeat verbs, tenses, or learn vocabulary in isolation. You need to bring it in to a conversation, into some point where you want to obtain something, ask for meaning, and there has to be a purpose. So when there's a purpose and there's going to be a context to use the language, that is going to be the way to acquire language. There has to be interaction.
Next, we have a question from Laura. How much does native language such as Zapotec influence Spanish fluency and accent?
Very much so. Zapotec is an indigenous language spoken in Mexico. There are many Zapotec speakers here in the Central Coast that are Mexican nationals that have Spanish as their non-dominant language. The same way that there can be Zapotec speakers here that are learning English and they don't really speak that much Spanish. So your first language system, be it Spanish, be French, be Zapotec, be Otomi, be Japanese, that's going to be kind of the system that you have. And when you're learning another language, there's going to be that cross-linguistic influence, right? That transfer from the taste, right? The ingredients that language has onto the other. So that's going to be, that's how we can listen to someone in English that speaks French without hearing them speak French, right? We can hear how certain words or sounds in English are pronounced, and we can already map that. Same we can do with Spanish or other languages. And this occurs with every single language we can think of. There's going to be some transfer of the sound system that's dominant in that individual bilingual speaker.
Now I have a question from Kirk, who says he's 72 years old, and first just wants to compliment you on a fantastic presentation. He asks a really practical question. How can I learn to make the trilled or the rolled R of Spanish, or is it too late for me?
It's never too late, but there are certain sounds that are easier or harder, right? So for instance, for a native English speaker, learning Spanish, the trill, the R sound is difficult because you cannot map it onto a specific sound in English that will be close enough. But the good news, or whatever, just to make everyone feel better here, is that it is also the hardest sound for a native Spanish speaker to learn. It is the sound, the last sound that a monolingual Spanish baby will learn to pronounce. It needs a lot more agility with the articulators to be able to pronounce it. Also, if we look at the different dialects and varieties of Spanish in the world, we're going to see that there's a lot of variation in how native Spanish speakers pronounce that R. So there's not a canonical R. It's interesting because I was debating if I was going to be presenting on a paper on R's that I did a study on R's, and I decided to take it out. But what I can say here is that the way that phonologists have been describing a canonical prototypical R doesn't necessarily match what people are doing. So even if we were going to pronounce the same word, like carro, car, 5 times, I can assure you that we would probably pronounce it 5 different ways. And that has been happening in the lab. We've been seeing a lot of variation in how people pronounce that sound. So I would say keep practicing. There are really cool websites where you can see what you're supposed to do with your tongue, where you're supposed to put your articulator, and just look yourself in the mirror and practice and practice and practice.
Next, we have a question from Stuart. With respect to the changes to English language due to the geographic and national separations resulting in American, British, and Australian English, could you speculate on future changes due to the wide galactic separations imposed by planetary colonization? Will we be unable to understand perhaps our descendants living on Mars?
Well, I'm going to speculate here and just say that language change is not just expected, it's inevitable. So with time, we're going to be shifting and understanding each other a lot less. So we're going to be moving around quite a bit. The fact that speakers of many different varieties, and I'm not just talking about different countries, right? I'm talking about like even different geographical terrains inside one country, shows you that there's a lot of diversity for every single language. So there's no reason to expect that to change anytime soon. There's going to be a lot of diversity, a lot of ways of speaking the same language, despite even in the situation of globalization that we have nowadays.
Now we have Anne, who is looking for some references. Can you recommend, and let's say we'd say put into the chat, or maybe I can get this afterwards. She's looking for some recent research about the cognitive advantages of bilingualism. So you can refer us to your paper.
Yes, I'll be happy to. And also I would recommend for the work that's been published on the cognitive advantages to check out the work of Ellen Bialystok at York University in Canada. She's been the author of a lot of these studies that have over 1,000 participants, so a lot of statistical power. Their lab has been very productive in that type of work. Also, I would recommend anyone to read work. There's another book by Francois Grosjean that came out, that's Life of a Bilingual. I would definitely recommend that book as well for more references. You're going to be find a lot of work on bilingualism, and especially from psycholinguistics of bilingualism.
Next, we have a question from Barbie. How does a person approach a person online when that person has a very heavy accent, which is difficult to understand? Asking the person to repeat slowly would obviously make them feel embarrassed.
That's a question that has occurred to me many times as well, right? I mean, I've been asked to repeat something, and I don't expect everyone to understand or to perceive the way a non-native speaker would perceive a language, would produce a certain sound of a language. in the same way. So I would say, yes, that would be the best way to do it, just to ask the person to repeat it again. I think that's something that happens even with native speakers of the language. And I think that's the polite way to do it, and to repeat it slowly. When we're speaking on the phone, we don't have other visual aids that also help us comprehend language, right? So if we're speaking on the phone, we cannot see the articulators, the movement of the mouth. That's something that, for instance, has I would say, has become more of a problem as we communicate with people with wearing face masks, for instance, because we're losing some very important nonverbal communication there as well that could help us understand better what our interlocutors are trying to tell us. So that being said, I would just say to ask the other person to repeat it as many times as necessary.
Okay, and I think Barbie wants to dig into your trilingual question a little bit. From these three languages, which language would help to learn the other two languages proficiently?
Well, so I was focusing on a very small pronunciation question, right? We're looking at the ka. So there are certain aspects of Japanese phonology that resemble Spanish more than English, right? So for some aspects of Japanese, for instance, a third language, knowing Spanish can help you sound more native-like than knowing English. And there's other language combinations that will be the other way around. For this specific sound, if you're learning Japanese ka, I would argue that if you speak Spanish and English, so you know that you have a short lag DOT for Spanish and a long lag DOT for English, producing something in the middle could be easier than if you had to just shorten both or lengthen both, right? So if you only speak English, you have to be able to produce a shortened DOT in Spanish, which can be closer maybe to the Japanese. So what I was showing in these results, which was the really take home message here, is that these trilingual speakers were very versatile in being able to shift their categories to accommodate, to give enough acoustic space for the other language. And that's showing that even if we expect there to be some type of interference, multilinguals like the ones that came into the lab were able to correct that, to maintain each of the sounds distinct. So it's going to depend on the aspect of the language. There's not going to be a response that says it's going to make all your language acquisition process easier or harder. It's going to depend on what aspect of pronunciation we're talking about, maybe what aspect of syntax or morphology or lexicon that we're learning, right? But what we know for a fact is that adding a third language to already a second language also seems to provide us some benefits.
Next, we have a question from Sandra. What did you mean when you spoke about hearing with an accent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this would be similar to what I was saying before, is that people typically think about people speaking with an accent, but we're also listening to sounds in our second language based on our perceptual system of our first language. There are certain combination of sounds that we expect to hear in our native tongue that are going to influence how we hear the other sounds that we're exposed to. For instance, we're is an acquisition is going to be to map a foreign sound to the closest native sound easily, easier to perceive than or to our native sound, but not exactly the same, but it's different. Those are going to be the difficult sounds. Sorry about that. That was my internet. Sorry. So what I was saying is that depending how close that second sound, that sound in our second language is to our native sound, to our native sound system, we're going to be mapping links that will make it easier or harder for us to accurately perceive a sound in a second language.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time here. We still have a long list of questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I think we can always count on our audience to ask a lot of amazing questions. And thanks everybody for reading them and for your upvotes and helping us out here. So why don't we close out with a big round of applause? You can type thanks in the Q&A box if you like, or but a big round of applause for Mark. Thank you for sharing your amazing insights with us this evening. I'll remind everybody this talk has been recorded and it will be available on the UC Santa Cruz Arts and Lectures YouTube channel in a day or two. Another big round of thanks, please, to the staff of the Alumni and University Events offices who organized this webinar. Thank you, Shana, Diana, Paulina, and Kristen. Our next event on Monday, January 10th, will feature Chris Wilmers, Professor of Wildlife Conservation, discussing large carnivore behavior and ecology in a human-dominated world. He has been studying large carnivores such as mountain lions, African lions, wolves, leopards, and bears for over 20 years, trying to understand how humans impact their behavior, ecology, populations, and conservation. Locally, Chris and his team are famous for studying mountain lions in the Santa Cruz Mountains for the past 14 years. Meanwhile, there are many other UCSC events that you might be interested in. Tomorrow evening, UCSC astronomers will share their excitement for the new James Webb Space Telescope that will be launching this month. They want to ask what big questions we expect to answer and how UCSC scientists will use it to understand our universe. This on-campus event includes speakers, audience Q&A, exhibit tables, and kid-friendly activities. More on this event and others can be found at events.ucsc.edu. On behalf of the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association, thank you for joining us, and please come back on January 10th, 6:30 p.m. for our next virtual event. Good night, everybody.